Hi.
What is the
All right, well, good afternoon. Welcome to Class 3 for Sacralism. We're a little bit lighter today. I think there was a couple families out, but that's all right. We keep chugging along, and the beauty with modern technology is we get to record it and hopefully bless others in the future. So what I want to do today, well, let me do a quick review just super quickly. So again, definition of sacralism, it's an unhealthy blending of the authority of the government and the church, and usually manifesting in a state church. So if you think of sacralism, it's just the whole concept of taking the spheres of the civil realm, taking the sphere of the church, blending that together in an unbiblical way, and usually you'll end up with some form of authoritarianism and some form of control that takes place and a state church. So that's what we talked about in the first lesson. Last time we talked about some important theological truths which weren't necessarily anything profound in themselves or new. It was just looking at foundational truths that I think help us to put the whole idea and the whole concept of sacralism it kind of in a more biblical terminology, because I think sometimes what happens in this discussion, especially in the modern context, is the foundational theological truths kind of get neglected, and everyone just kind of jumps to the high, philosophical or even historical aspects and end there. So I think it's important to lay down certain truths. That's what we tried to do last time. Today I want to take a kind of just a very short and broad historical look at sacralism at play, sacralism at work in history throughout the church. And I think history is very important here because we're not dealing with just a simple chapter and verse issue, right? So when you're dealing with the whole idea of sphere sovereignty, how the spheres relate, government, like it's not just this simple chapter and verse. And also, it's not a simple doctrinal issue. It's not like you can just, here's the Trinity and here's what the church has believed in, period. No, we're dealing with something a little more complicated. We're dealing with applicational truth. We're dealing with multiple theological truths, multiple passages that come into play, and we're trying to put them together and understand how does this now work out in application in life as we try to live in God's kingdom. So I think we need history to guide us in this. We need history to help us in this. And specifically, my goal is going to be more looking at the negative aspect of sacralism, the negative historical examples that we find. And typically this is referred to as Christendom 1.0. I don't know if that's probably more of a modern, kind of terminology, but it's kind of the whole concept of the church all the way up to the modern era, up to the Reformation, up to when the church had a predominant rule in society. And so that whole concept of Christendom 1.0, that's usually what it looks at, is this historical landscape. And part of it is we're looking at what we can learn from it, because obviously not all of it's negative, but also we're looking at the abuses of Christendom 1.0 and the abuses that then lead, which I would argue, to sacralism. And I think that's what we've been arguing. Now, what we're going to do is I just want to look at some historical examples of sacralism. Now, I am looking at predominantly negative examples. But don't walk away thinking that, everything that these people did is negative. That's obviously not the case. There's much good that came out of all of these people in different contexts, and so that's important to understand. And I also acknowledge that there is a context to all of these examples. There's a context to led to what they did that helps to explain, helps to understand why they did what they did, but at the end of the day, I believe it doesn't excuse what took place. It doesn't excuse the whole reality of sacralism at play. And the main issue, I think, really, as I think about this topic, I think the main issue here is the whole concept of the state church versus a free church. Sacralism, what it does at the end of the day is, because it blends the church, the sphere of the church and the sphere of the civil realm, it creates a state-regulated religion, a state-regulated church. And anybody who's outside of that is persecuted. Any dissenter to that is pushed out of the way, and at its worst, is put to death. So that's really kind of what I think the main issue, the crust of the whole idea of sacralism. Let me read from Fox's Book of Martyrs. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this work. It's an interesting work because it was written by a man during the whole Puritan persecution time frame, John Fox, and he's living through sacralism. He's living through sacralism, and he writes this book looking at the examples of persecution that took place. And the first, I think it's the first three chapters all have to do with secular persecution. So predominantly the early church prior to Constantine. But it's interesting because once he gets into chapter 4, here's how he starts this chapter, and I found this interesting. Thus far, our history of persecution has been confined principally to the pagan world. We come now to a period when persecution, under the guise of Christianity, committed more enormities than ever disgraced the annals of paganism. Disregarding the maxims and the spirit of the gospel, the papal or Catholic Church, arming herself with the power of the sword, vexed the Church of God and wasted it for several centuries, a period most appropriately termed in history the Dark Ages. The kings of the earth gave their power to the beast and submitted to be trodden on by the miserable vermin that often filled the papal chair. As in the case of Henry, Emperor of Germany, the storm of papal persecution first burst upon the Waldensians in France. And then he goes on to talk about that whole situation, the persecution of the Waldensians in France. But it's quite interesting what he says there. You know, after spending, what is it, you know, over 50 pages about the persecution from the Roman Empire, and elaborating on that, he says, but yet it doesn't even compare to the persecution of what, quote unquote, the church did towards other Christians. That's quite interesting. And I think what he's doing there, I think that's a perfect summary of what sacralism produces. Sacralism produces complete and utter persecution of anybody that disagrees with your position, anybody that disagrees with your perspective, down to the T. Because you gained the power, you gained control. Okay, so when we start our historical account, we have to start with Constantine. We mentioned Constantine, I think in our first class, and sometimes this whole concept is referred to as Constantinianism. So Constantine was a Roman Empire, and obviously, so he's in the 4th century. The early church was under heavy persecution, as we just talked about. Up into that time, there's waves of persecution. Sometimes heavy, sometimes not so heavy. Some leaders are more lenient to Christians. Some are very heavy in their persecution of Christians. And really, the focus of the church is survival in many ways. And you did have certain men that were called apologists that rose up. Justin Martyr is a very popular one. They rose up and they plead to the civil authorities of the saneness of the Christian faith, and that many of the lies that were spread about Christians were not true. So you had pockets of Christians engaging with the civil realm, but in many ways it was just kind of survival because of the persecution. Now, the Roman Empire was beginning to decline in some way in power, and especially the role of the emperor. And the empire actually got divided into 2 parts. So you had the east and you had the west. And each then, east and west, was divided into 2 subsections or 2 subcategories. Constantine was a ruler of one of those subsections. And his counterpart was Maxentius. And they went to war. So they battled together over who's going to be kind of the top dog, who's going to be the emperor. And Constantine, even prior to that time, he was sympathetic to Christianity and towards Christians in general. Then in 312, they went to war over power, and then Constantine, during that time, right before a crucial battle, he allegedly saw a vision of the cross with the words on it, "In this sign conquer." So he took that as a sign that he needs to follow. He took that as a vision from God. And then after he won the battle, he converted to Christianity. And the whole sense and feel of the Roman Empire really began to change at that time and became favorable towards Christianity. Now, he wasn't the one who instituted Christianity as kind of the state religion. That was Theodosius in 380. So we have many decades of growth and change and transition, and even with Constantine, he instituted and issued something referred to as the Edict of Milan in 313. I keep wanting to say 13, but 313. And Christianity begins to become the prominent religion. But obviously during that time, the pagan religions of the Roman culture and the Roman religions remain still at play. And many of the under-rulers under Constantine would still have held to those old religions. But, if your boss and your emperor converts and he's all about Christianity now, well, that's gonna sway a little bit which direction you go in terms of what you're going to favor, and in many ways, obviously, persecution slows down like crazy. Let me read here from, this is from Abraham Kuyper on his book On the Church, as he looks at a little bit of the history of this time. Yet this flow of thought could not be avoided after Constantine's conversion to Christianity. The Christianizing of the emperor's crown in Byzantium was in itself too surprising an event not to give joy to all that was Christian. The persecution was now over. Instead of persecution came elevation and honor. And as usual, with such a turn of events, thousands and 10,000s of pagans joined the Christian church, as is characteristic for that indifferent crowd that naturally joins every movement that arises. But on the other hand, there's no doubt that the baptism of Emperor Constantine became the starting point of an internal decay in the church, and in its relationship with the government, and its consequences negatively affect the well-being of the churches still today. Constantine's conversion not only stopped the persecution, but brought in its place power and wealth for the leaders and the heads of the churches. The poverty in which the church had struggled was now replaced by abundance, and thus the bishop's word gained unchallenged authority, even in matters of the state. With very few exceptions, the clergy of that time could not resist this inherent temptation, and they gladly granted the emperor superior influence in all ecclesiastical affairs, as long as it remained clear that pagan philosophy and pagan religion were to be restricted, and that the church should no longer suffer at their hands. There was little opposition when Emperor Constantine, in his famous speech, established the rule that the bishops would hold all authority as far as the internal affairs of the church were concerned, but that he, Constantine, was appointed by God as the bishop for external affairs. So Kuyper there is talking about how this whole idea of Constantine taking the empire in a more pro-Christian environment, obviously it brought with it many positives, but it also brought with it many negatives. And I think the best way to describe that is that it brought with it nominalism. And that's typically what happens. Usually when a religion becomes the prominent religion, and becomes closely tied to the government of that state or that environment, then you're going to have much nominalism that takes place. Now, part of this is somewhat natural. Religion was ingrained into that culture. So obviously, if you're going to have a ruler that's going to convert to a certain religion, that religion is going to influence what that ruler does and how that ruler functions. But the issue is not necessarily that, and that's not what sacralism is looking at. Sacralism is looking at the fact that when that goes too far, when you have a blending to such degree that now the state becomes the overseer of the church, or really vice versa, as we've talked about, how that battle goes back and forth. And actually, I apologize, I missed one sentence. I thought it was on the other page. Here's how Kuyper ends. It is therefore safe to say that from 324 AD, the authority in the entire Eastern Church was actually in the hands of the emperor. So I think in many ways, when we look at history, I think it's safe to say that this time frame, this encounter that Constantine had, it laid the groundwork for sacralism because, like I said, because specifically it brought in a large amount of nominalism. Constantine, he demanded strict obedience from the church officials, as he did also from his civil subjects, even if it contradicted church teaching. So he took it to that direction and went so far that he demanded allegiance to him, and he didn't really care at the end of the day if it contradicted church teaching. Now, again, I'm summarizing a lot of this, and there's a lot of contextual aspects to much of this. And I'm not going into Nicaea, which is quite interesting in and of itself, and his role in that, which wasn't that much, but I'm skipping over a lot of this. Obviously, I'm trying to do kind of a big picture overview. So this then starts this whole idea and this whole time frame of what we would call as Christendom 1.0, and I would say the decay into sacralism. Let me read from Joe Boot in his book. We're already familiar with this book. Our first lesson, we read parts of it, but he gives a little bit of a summary here that I think is helpful. So, he quotes from Kuyper again. Kuyper's description of the result is telling. When the imperial power of Rome faded, then the ecclesiastical influence of the Bishop of Rome increased. It was inevitable that the ecclesiastical power, so the power of the church, which continued to develop under this hierarchical presidency of the Pope, became the competitor to the decaying political unity. So he's saying after Constantine, you began to see this challenge of authority, this battle of authority that took place. The Pope and the structure of the church began to challenge the emperor and the structure of the civil realm, and you just had for many, many centuries this back and forth that would take place, which inherently is what sacralism is. The competitor to decaying political unity, the Roman Empire gradually crumbled altogether. And since the significance of the political unity of power continually diminished, it was inevitably that the ecclesiastical power, which even more strongly possessed a universal character, eventually overshadowed the political power. This could change only when the Roman Empire was transferred to the Germanic nations as the Holy Roman Empire. And we'll get into a little bit of this. But this happened by making an even stronger opposition between emperor and pope. The doctrine of the two swords entered the world. The pope was to be honored as the representative of Christ, and therefore all worldly power should be subject to Rome's tribunal. Let me see if I want to... Okay, we'll stop there. There's other things that's really interesting, and I would strongly recommend this book. But during that time, and he already hinted at this, the Roman Catholic Church then developed this doctrine of the two swords, and that kind of comes from Luke chapter 22 of when the apostles tell him, the disciples, we have two swords, he says that's enough. And they take that concept and they say that there's two swords in this world. God has two swords. He has the Pope, which has the spiritual sword, and then he has the power and the civil rulers, which have the civil sword, and they have the temporal power. So the Pope has the spiritual power and they have the temporal power, but even the temporal power is under the authority of the church. So they would have elevated the one sword over the other. But then also during this time there develops a doctrine of the divine right of kings, and I think Ethan talked about this in his class, and that's where this whole idea develops, where the monarchs were given, because they were God's appointed representatives, they cannot be opposed. So therefore, whatever the king says is word, and that goes. So there's no sense of opposition that takes place there. There's no sense of any concept of a free church. Everything is under the authority of the emperor, also the authority of the Pope, and those two begin to battle with each other. One of the things that this produces, and we're skipping forward a little bit here into the 8th and 9th century, is what's referred to as the iconoclastic controversy. And the iconoclastic controversy really is this whole concept of who has the authority. Who has the greater authority? So Emperor Leo III, he concluded that the church's use of icons was idolatrous, and he banned them. Okay, so he had a right conclusion, right? But as a result, because he has the authority, he says, I am banning them. So he's stepping into the authority of the church, and he's banning practices of the church. Now, the church, obviously, the Pope, the authority, the hierarchs of the church obviously disagreed with him. So the Pope and the Patriarch in Constantinople, they objected. So what did the emperor do? Well, he removed military support from the Pope for that city at a very crucial time because they were under attack. So you have this battle that's going back and forth. And each of them are using their sword to try to fight with each other and demonstrate which sword is greater. So then the Pope has to align himself with the Franks. So this is where, remember, it was, can't remember if it was Kuyper or Booth that talked about the Franks, so which were the Germanic tribes. So he goes outside of Rome at that time and aligns himself with the Germanic tribes, and they were most likely the first Germanic tribes to convert to Christianity. So he aligns himself with the Germanic tribes, gets military support from them, and because the emperor removed the military support. So this was the civil realm going into the spiritual realm and dictating the worship of the church. I think it's a wonderful example of sacralism at work. We lived through some of that, right? Not too long ago, where you have the civil realm. And then what's interesting too is you have a lot of different examples here of where each of them, the civil realm, so we'll say the emperor and the pope, each of them use the authority that's given to them, and in their authority they try to control the other authority. So you have obviously the example here of Emperor Leo, who controls the army, so he uses that to his advantage. Well, you have, I don't remember the names now, but you have other examples of where the Pope becomes so popular that the Pope gets to control the emperor and even appoint the emperor and give his blessing. And if he doesn't, if the emperor does something that is in opposition to the Pope would throw him out of the church. So there's literally, I don't remember the names now, maybe one of you will remember at the end then and can mention it, but where the Pope, where the emperor had to come to the Pope, and the Pope made him wait outside in the snow for multiple days, and the emperor came to beg for mercy and to repent to the Pope. And it was the Pope's way to show that he's in charge, he's the boss. The church, the sword of the church, is in charge. In the 9th century, we have the example of Charlemagne. It's King Charles the Great is who it is, but a popular historical figure we see in many accounts, but he's one of these Frank monarchs, one of these monarchs of the Franks, and he's a prominent player in this struggle between the authority of the state and the authority of the church. He held a trial. There was an accusation that was brought against the Pope, and he held a trial and at that time, the only person that could really judge the Pope is the emperor himself. Now, he wasn't the emperor at this time because he controlled only a certain region, but he pretty much went outside of that and he held a trial, and these accusations were brought, and he in this trial, he demonstrated that the accusations were not true, but he spent much of his rule during that time trying to show the Pope that he was in charge of all that takes place. Let me read from Sunshine does a really good job summarizing a lot of these different accounts, but let me read some of this. The tension between Pope and Emperor had been festering for some time, but the issue that brought the conflict into the open was lay investiture of bishops, that is, political authorities, vesting bishops with the ring and crozier, which are the symbols of a bishop's spiritual office. So pretty much he's saying, who gets to elect the bishops? There became a struggle and a tension, who gets to elect the bishops? Is it the Pope or is it the Emperor? This was a consequence of bishops fulfilling roles in secular government and thus being appointed by emperors, kings, and dukes, rather than being elected by the canons of the cathedral with the approval of the Pope. From the emperor's perspective, the bishops were part of his administration, so he had the right to choose them. The pope's response was that the bishops were primarily ecclesiastical officers, so they needed to be selected by the church. So isn't it interesting how you have it that this tension and this sacralism becomes so big that you had bishops that were involved in both spheres of the church, both spheres of authority. Who gets to give a bishop the symbol of his office may seem like a trivial issue, but underlying it was the question of primacy between church and state. Was the church over the state, as Gelasius had declared, or was the emperor over the church, following Constantine and Charlemagne? Of course, this argument conveniently ignored the Eastern emperor in Constantinople. This dispute pitted the bishops' loyalty to the church against their loyalty to the state. The conflict was long and difficult, with excommunications, depositions, and open warfare on both sides. So you have both trying to use their authority, both trying to use their sword. Eventually, an accommodation was reached in the Concordat of Worms, 1122, which recognized the claims of both sides, with precedents determined more by proximity to the papal or imperial court than by any political or theological considerations. Let me read a little bit more here. Throughout the conflict, both sides recognized that both church and state were ordained by God and given specific responsibilities. The real question was the boundary between them. But the controversy extended well beyond just the rights of Pope and Emperor. The Catholic Church claimed other legal rights and responsibilities that did not always sit well with civil governments. For example, members of the clergy, which in the Middle Ages included university students, could only be tried in church courts, not secular courts. Further, issues related to sacraments and other religious actions could only be adjudicated by church courts. This included anything related to marriage as a sacrament, but also probate and contract laws, since these were tantamount to vows and thus an activity regulated by canon or church law. I'll stop there. Again, there's a lot of other good stuff here. But pretty much it got to the point where the church, whatever it claimed was its own authority, and remember the Catholic Church has a lot more sacraments than we do, so whatever they claimed that was under their authority, they would say that the civil realm has nothing to say to this. And because they went way beyond what the Bible allows them to, that's where sacralism came in. Jumping into the 11th century, we have Pope Gregory the Seventh, and he promoted the concept of papal supremacy over kings. And this was the controversy that developed the battle between who gets to appoint the bishops, the investiture controversy, who gets to appoint the bishops, or even the Pope himself. There even came a debate of who gets to appoint the Pope himself. Is it the emperor? Does the emperor get to appoint the Pope? Or is it the church that gets to decide who's going to be the ruler of the church? In the 12th century, you have Pope Innocent III, and he probably was the most powerful one when it came to at what point did the church have the greatest power. He strengthened the concept of sacralism because he went into intervening in political affairs in Europe. He would actually control the election of rulers. He would pretty much say, I am the man, and everything is under the authority of the church, and because I am the highest authority of the church, I am going to control everything. And some historians say that probably he was the most powerful person in the world at that time, which is quite a title. He's also the one who instituted the Inquisition. So this is the time frame that the Inquisition comes from. let me read here from, so this is not actually from the Fox's Book of Martyr, went through a couple editions and things were added in, but when the Reformed religion began to diffuse the gospel light throughout Europe, Pope Innocent III entertained great fear for the Romish Church. He accordingly instituted a number of inquisitors or persons who were to make inquiry after, apprehend, and punish heretics, as the Reformed were called by the Papists. At the head of these inquisitors was one Dominic, who had been canonized by the Pope. Let me actually, hang on, let me jump forward here. The most zealous of all the popish monks and those who most implicitly obeyed the Church of Rome were the Dominicans and the Franciscans. These, therefore, the Pope thought proper to invest with an exclusive right of presiding over the different courts of inquisition, and gave them the most unlimited powers as judges delegated by him. And immediately representing his person, they were permitted to excommunicate or sentence to death whom they thought proper, upon the most slight information of heresy. They were allowed to publish crusades against all whom they deemed heretics, and enter into leagues with sovereign princes to join their crusades with their forces. So it's kind of interesting. Pretty much it got to the point where the Catholic Church, or we'll just say the church, to loosely historically use that term, but the church pretty much started acting like it was a nation in and of itself. But because it had full power and authority over the whole entire world, because it had the gospel message, it pretty much became the nation of the whole entire world. So therefore, these inquisitors could go into any nation and have full authority to do whatever they needed to do and punish whoever they needed to punish. And the civil realm didn't really matter at that point. So that was Pope Innocent III. Now, we're going to jump forward here we're just going to look at Martin Luther. So I mentioned this a little bit ago, but when we think about the Reformation, the first generation reformers and some of the second generation reformers, they're referred to as the magisterial reformers. And that's because of this whole concept really of sacralism, because it was a Reformation that was closely tied to the state in which they lived in. So Martin Luther, being a magisterial reformer, his story is quite interesting because he develops the two-kingdom doctrine. So the classic kind of two-kingdom doctrine that we've recently, in the past few years, heard thrown around. The Lutherans are kind of maybe the original two-kingdom to some degree, the original two-kingdom doctrine. And that's heavily influenced by Augustine's work on the city of God. Augustine, when he talks about the two different cities and the realm of the cities, so this whole concept is heavily influenced by that, where you have the spiritual kingdom and then you have the physical kingdom. Now, the two-kingdom doctrine goes through different changes, and Calvin takes it and he kind of reforms it and puts his own spin on it, and then more modern, kind of referred to as the radical two-kingdom, they take this concept, kind of put their spin on it, but we're not going to get into that. But Martin Luther, even though he started to develop this kind of, there needs to be some division that's seen between the spheres, he still held to a strong connection to the government authorities. And really, when you look at Luther, there's almost kind of two different Luthers. And I would recommend, James White did a talk, it's found on Sovereign Nations. If you just search on YouTube, James White Luther, it'll kind of show up, the two Luthers. It's quite interesting because you have the Luther prior to 1525, which was the peasant revolt that takes place. Luther actually begins to develop understandings that would favor a free church. When the Anabaptists come on the scene, he begins to reason with them. There's some level of back and forth. But when the peasant revolt takes place in 1525, and that's when the peasants who were under heavy rule by the authorities, and eventually they just had enough of it, they revolted, and Luther, when he saw that, he pretty much sided with the civil authorities, and I think there was like over 100,000 peasants that were killed at that time. So you had a massive revolt, massive bloodshed that takes place, and that really changes his whole perspective on the whole concept of anarchy and how the free church will lead to anarchy, and we have to do everything possible to stop that. And that's when he adopts really a sacralist perspective himself, where I think prior to that he was beginning to kind of go away from that perspective. So he promoted, obviously, a state church, and there's this famous example of Fritz Erba. Some of you, I'm sure, heard of that, of Fritz Erba, who was an Anabaptist. So he was in prison. He was arrested by the authorities and imprisoned by the authority of the church for not baptizing his children. And the reason that he refused to baptize his children, I know this is profound, but because he read his Bible. He read the German Bible that Luther himself translated. And he was in prison in the Wittenberg Castle where Luther translated that Bible. And he ended up dying there. They literally just had this small little hole that was super deep. They put him down, and he was just kept there for, I think it was like 7 or 8 years. And they would try to preach to him, they would try to convert him, and he ended up dying there. And this was 10 years after Luther translated the German Bible. So you, even under the Reformers, you have sacralism that takes a primary role in how the Reformers were reforming these nations. And I want to pause here, and I want to acknowledge the fact that obviously there's a context to a lot of this. The radical Anabaptists, they did not help the cause. Anabaptist is a very broad term, and there were good Anabaptists, and then there were just radical, wacko Anabaptists. So they did not help the cause. The Zwickau prophets were one of the Anabaptists that interacted with the Reformers, and they were just wacko charismatics. Münster is a very interesting story. Again, I would strongly recommend just do a search, James White, Münster, where he talks about how the Anabaptists, the radical Anabaptists, pretty much take over the whole entire city, and they form a complete cult. And because they believe that this is going to be the New Jerusalem, this is where this is the place now. And I mean, it is just insanity what they do there. And eventually, I mean, it was so bad that actually the Roman Catholics and the Protestants wanted them gone. So they literally just joined forces, and they sieged that city for over a year. They sieged that city. And it's a crazy story. So I acknowledge again that there's a context to a lot of this. And the radical Anabaptists did not help the cause. But that still does not excuse how you have somebody like Luther who breaks away from a sacralist religion and a context because the Spirit works in his heart and he understands the Bible for how it truly is to be understood. And he's breaking away from that rule, breaking away from that. And then he himself adopts the very exact mentality to try to keep others at bay when they break away from his teaching. John Bunyan is another example of this in the 17th century. He was arrested under the Religion Act of 1592, or Act of Supremacy, or sometimes it's called the Act Against the Puritans. And it pretty much made the monarch of England the supreme ruler of the church. So it created the Church of England. It controlled worship. It persecuted any dissenter, so anybody who would dissent and would disagree, would not preach exactly how they say. It persecuted them. It banned church attendance outside of the parish church with more than 5 people outside of your family. Again, we all have echoes to 2020, right? We all have echoes of where the sphere of the civil realm begins to dictate and control the realm of the church. Now, John Bunyan, he believed in a free church, and he believed in the ability to preach God's word in accordance to his convictions. And he preached, and he got arrested, and he spent time in prison, and then he was released. So John Bunyan is another example of this whole idea of sacralism. Another interesting, we're right at the end here, another interesting kind of historical aspect that we see here is the American revision of the Westminster Confession of Faith. So typically when we look at the Westminster Confession of Faith, it's typically the original, which was done under the authority of the state. Well, there's an American revision of it, and let me read here. One of the things they change is they completely rewrite the whole idea of the civil magistrate and the authority of the civil magistrate. So here's the original one. The civil magistrate may not assume to himself the administration of the word and sacraments or the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Yet he has authority, and it is his duty to take order that unity and peace be preserved in the church, that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed, all corruptions and abuses in worship and discipline prevented or reformed, and all the ordinances of God duly settled, administered, and observed. For the better effecting whereof he has power to call synods, to be present at them, and to provide that whatsoever is transacted in them be according to the mind of God. So notice the authority that's given to the civil realm, to the authority that's given to the civil magistrate. Here's the American revision of it. Civil magistrates may not assume to themselves the administration of the word and sacraments, or the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven, or in the least interfere in matters of faith. Yet as nursing fathers, it is the duty of civil magistrate to protect the church of our common Lord without giving the preference to any denomination of Christians above the rest, in such a manner that all ecclesiastical persons, whatever shall enjoy the full, free, and unquestioned liberty of discharging every part of their sacred functions without violence or danger. And as Jesus Christ has appointed a regular government and discipline in his church, no law of any commonwealth should interfere with, let or hinder the due exercise thereof among the voluntary members of any denomination of Christians, according to their own profession and belief. It is the duty of civil magistrates to protect the person and good name of all their people in such an effectual manner as that no person be suffered either upon pretense of religion or of infidelity to offer any indignity, violence, abuse, or injury to any other person whatsoever, and to take order that all religious and ecclesiastical assemblies be held without molestation or disturbance. It's quite a difference we see there. Quite a difference we see there of how one is produced under a sacralist environment. One is produced under an environment where the parliament tells you to go and make this confession. Again, I fully acknowledge, again, I'm emphasizing the negative aspects. Obviously, there's many positives, and I love the Westminster Confession of Faith. But you see a difference there. And the other one is changed by under a free church. And I think that's really the key. And I'll end with this. I think a modern example, which is quite interesting, a modern example of sacralism is seen in the Vatican City. So the Vatican City it's acknowledged as it's a sovereign state. It's an independent sovereign state in Italy. The Pope is the supreme ruler. So this is from their website. The form of government is an absolute monarchy. The sovereign of the state is the supreme pontiff who has full legislative, executive, and legislative power. So that's the Pope. The Vatican City Court, which is the highest judicial court of the state, okay, am I back? Check, 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 check. Doesn't sound like it. Okay. Back? No? Back? Oh, is it just, okay. Okay. Well, all of you here heard what I was saying, so that's all that matters. And then it was interesting too. I was reading about the Vatican City, but defense attorneys. So if there's a case that's brought before the Vatican City Court, the defense attorneys, they must be approved by the Vatican City. So you can't just go and hire your own defense attorney if there's a case that's brought before you. It has to be somebody who's approved by the church, approved by the Vatican City. So I just thought it was kind of interesting, thinking through sacralism, thinking through just how this looks. The modern Vatican City is kind of an example of that, and really just lives up to its historical name of what we've seen in the Roman Catholic Church. So, okay, I know that was just a very broad overview, and like I said, I emphasized the negative aspect of sacralism. I know there's a context to a lot of some of this stuff, and obviously nuances and positives that were brought down. I mean, we can look at Constantine and bring out many positives that took place, and that's good and that's fine. Obviously, I don't pray for persecution. That's not my prayer. So there's many positives that take place, but when we're thinking through the whole idea of sacralism and going too far in understanding these spheres, there's a lot of negatives that history offers. And the question is, as we look at this landscape of Christendom 1.0, what can we learn, right? We see many, many abuses. And the question that I think we have to ask rightly, and I think the question that many in the modern church, kind of especially with the rise of postmillennialism, a theonomic perspective, many are asking, okay, well, what can we learn and how can it be approved, and how should it look in Christendom 2.0, if we can use that terminology, which I know Doug Wilson uses that terminology. So I'll stop there. Any questions, comments?
It hit me, I wasn't aware of that, but it makes sense. I'm not saying I'm in favor of it, but it makes sense that the church would get involved in contract law. Because if you presume that most of your citizens are Christian, you think, oh, well, Paul says don't go before.
Yeah.
Well, when Paul was writing it, don't go before a pagan court if you've got a contract dispute with a fellow Christian. So you could, in other words, if you're able to talk to them, they say, well, of course we should do it this way.
Yeah.
We're obeying Paul.
Sure. Yeah. And like I said, I mean, there's a lot of things that we can look at in the involvement of the church that I think we can learn from, and that's good. In terms of, obviously, the Bible is a book for all of life, and yeah, there's aspects. I don't know. I haven't thought too deep about that, and how far do we take that? But yeah, there's definitely aspects that we can learn and maybe implement. And I think I know just in my own experience, it's interesting how many Christians in America have created this divide between church and business, to the point of where you'll have Christians that will refuse to do work in their own church because they don't want to blend business and church. They just don't want to have any issues. They don't want to do it, and it's sad because there's obviously, you can go too far on that extreme too, of that there's a beauty in building the church, building the kingdom, and contributing to that, and establishing this, that some of the modern guys have kind of called the alternative economy in the application of Christian truth. But yeah, a little off topic here, but. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that really dates back to the Reformation, that when Luther translated the Bible into German, I mean, that was damning material there. He was pretty much damning himself. But yeah. And I think that's also I like phrasing this discussion in the context of a state church and a free church. Because I think there's, again, I mean, both of them can have their abuses, but I think the beauty is when you let the Spirit work through the power of the gospel, you're going to have a natural growth of the Christian faith in society, which next time is going to be, I'm going to critique sacralism. I mean, that's going to be one of my main critiques, is sacralism just ignores the biblical truth of how it's the gospel that transforms lives and societies. And I think if you force it, what we saw throughout history is massive nominalism. And that doesn't help the cause of the church. So being able to read the Bible, being able to study it, being able to be part of a church that can help you to study it and learn it, and that's a beautiful and good thing, and not being afraid of, being persecuted because what if you don't adopt the specific exact, view that the Pope says.
What is your view about the church or churches having
I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily relevant to sacralism, but I mean, I think it's one of those things where I'm not necessarily opposed to it, but I think there has to be massive caution in how it's played out. Yeah, I don't know. I would have to think more about that, because I mean, I guess my big, just the way my brain always works is I'm always thinking through, okay, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of whatever I'm thinking through? And when you have a proper society and you have a proper civil realm, I don't. Obviously, people being armed for the purposes of self-defense is an informal militia in and of itself. I don't think it's the job of the church to have a ministry, a militia ministry. I don't see that in Scripture. We're not given the sword, right? That we're not given the sword of physical judgment. So I don't think that's necessarily the realm of the church. But yeah, I don't.
I was just gonna, I had a thought that, it's a lot like parenting, isn't it? Like, when the Westminster Catechism talks about, being father, or how do they word it in the Westminster Catechism?
I don't remember which part.
Yeah, when we read about nursing father.
Oh, okay, the confession. Okay, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Anyway, I just the way that they go about it, it's very authoritarian, and I'm just thinking about some of the things that have been Christian nationalism. Because from what I've been reading of it, tends to have that authoritarian side to it, whereas. And I don't want you to like. I don't know. I guess I don't really know what I just thought of it from like a parenting perspective, as I tend to come parenting from more authoritarian. I came from an authoritarian family, and that's how I was raised. So I'm trying to like unlearn some of those habits because I don't agree with them. Like I think there needs to be. I'm still in authority, but I think it needs to be like a better training. I don't know if you can see what I'm saying.
No, I do, yeah, and I think you're right. Sacralism definitely leads to an authoritarian perspective and view, and just kind of an application of sacralism is, I think, authoritarian, because there's always going to be a struggle for authority. Now, and this is where this conversation is kind of difficult, as I was saying in my first lesson. Like there's aspects of sacralism, if we want to put it that way, that I like, in terms of, obviously you're going to have authority. Nobody wants anarchy, right? Nobody wants a peasant revolution. We're not called to just grab our arms, grab our militias, and revolt, right? I mean, I think, as I talked about last time, I think that's the whole point of Romans 13, is to teach us the fact that we're not to just, stand up whenever we want and just revolt and do whatever we want and have anarchy. So obviously you're gonna have authority, and there should be authority. The question is, what is the sphere of that authority? And where does your authority end? And I think it's easy when I think about, so if I was Roman Catholic, I would love sacralism. And there is actually a modern sacralistic Roman Catholic movement. It's kind of their version of Christian nationalism. But I think it makes sense from a Roman Catholic perspective. I mean, you already have the hierarchical structure that would demand that. So you might as well say that the Pope is the supreme ruler. He's the boss. He's the pontiff. But that's not my theology. So my theology is one of I see a free church taught in the New Testament. A church ruled by elders, plurality of elders, and those churches under the banner of Christ. But do you force your perspective and your view upon others? And that's where that whole thing of authority comes to play. And I think where sacralism goes wrong, and I think where some of the modern Christian nationalism discussion goes wrong, is they're promoting a view of, well, some of them aren't even post-millennial, so I can't even say post-millennialism, but they're promoting a view of post-millennialism that is forced. So it's forced post-millennialism. And I'm going to argue I don't see that in Scripture. What I see is a Spirit-led post-millennialism through the gospel. All the nations will come to love the law of the Lord. Well, that's because the Spirit has worked upon them. That's not because the Supreme Pontiff has declared it so, even though it's easy to do that. Yeah.
I'm wondering, like I've seen a lot of people caricature post-millennialism and say, oh, we're not supposed to bring up the millennium, which is true, and I think it's coming from an Arminian perspective, right? Because from a Calvinist perspective, we're saying it's the Holy Spirit that's a member of the Trinity that's going to bring about the millennium, because he's going to quicken a large number of people in a certain generation, and then that's going to affect culture and civil government and everything. Right? But it won't be us do it. So I think the people that caricature it that way don't even see, their soteriology is free will, choice.
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides to that. I mean, there's obviously, a large Reformed sect of the church that would not agree with postmillennialism, and they would have that wouldn't apply to them. But I'm sure, from an Arminian perspective, I could see that as being an objection.
But I'm wondering if you're an Arminian and also taking the label Christian nationalism, you want to use government coercion because that's your only lever.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I haven't thought through details of that. Yeah, it could be.
It'd be interesting to do a survey and discover that most of the people are Arminian who are prone to that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and and I'm not necessarily against the phrase Christian nationalist. I think, again, if it's understood biblically, I don't. It's just the problem is, again, we're using terminology that a lot of times has a lot of negative connotation with it. I mean, and that's where some of this stuff is hard to try to pinpoint, and that's why we need to talk. We need to have dialogue. We need to let people explain what they mean, and and that's helpful. But at the same time, we have to use some terms to describe stuff. We have to use certain labels. But I've learned in my study of theology, there's always a spectrum. You can use a term, but there's always a spectrum that you have to be mindful of. There's always some balance that you have to be mindful of. Even in this overview, obviously, what was my emphasis? My emphasis was negative predominantly. But like I said, there's a lot of positives too that were there.